Similarly, trade unionism obviously has tried to protect the privilege of a male breadwinner wage, a higher wage for men, on the basis that that wage is meant to support an entire family, not just an individual. Okay? So that has led to, historically, a systematic downplaying of women's salaries, which of course continues to exist today. Does anyone have any questions before I move on to my totally favourite part of this lecture, the angel in the home? No? Is that all clear? That's basically an initial orientation, so you need to be clear before we move on. Now I know, because you've all been reading Mrs. Beeton, that everybody already knows what the angel in the home is going to look like. And I look forward to talking to you about Mrs. Beeton, one of my all-time favourite books. I have the copy that was my grandmother's and then my mother's, which is a little emasculating, but I'm learning to live with it. Okay. The first point to establish here is that women basically had no effective legal personality in early 19th century Britain. They had no right to divorce. Divorce was only something that could be achieved through an act of parliament. So obviously just for the preserve of the extremely wealthy. And they had no capacity to own their own property. So that their legal and economic position was one intimately connected to the men who were supposed to rule over and look after them. That is, their fathers and their husbands. This becomes one of the first things that the early feminist movement campaigns against, and we'll come to this at the end of the lecture. But it's the Langham Place Circle, the women around the Langham Place Circle, I'll come back to this, who push for the reform of divorce and for the reform of the right of women to own their own property. And this comes out in two critical acts. The Matrimonial Causes Act in 1857, which basically creates divorce courts. But it's still highly, highly restrictive. You have to prove adultery, bigamy, cruelty, or desertion. And then the Married Women's Property Act of 1882, which allowed women to hold property in their own terms, as well as to have to be pursued for their own debts. That's to say I was to die and leave my daughter, who would be fictionally 18, okay, my house, she would not have been able to inherit that house. Okay, so you have to have the creation of a legal position where she was entitled to. If she was 18 and married, and I left her her house, that house would have gone to her husband. Okay, so married women were in an extremely vulnerable position until the Married Women's Property Act. Second point that I want to make here is that I don't want you to think that that meant that all women were therefore totally subordinate captives of men. Many women were very active economic agents, running, helping to run, and in some cases even running their own businesses. So we know that women were very involved in the running of family enterprises, doing accounts, running shops, etc. We also know that women and the marriage trade was a vital way in which people raised capital for their business before the introduction of limited liability laws in 1862. So if you have a business and you want to raise capital, okay, often what you did was advance the interests of your family through a marriage to another family with capital, so that you would then hook in the capital of two families behind one business. So there was effectively a marriage market in which women stood in as bearers of capital that they didn't then have access to, but their husbands did. Now, it was the case that when a family business, when the man in a family business died, the husband in a family business died, it was the case that widows could own property, and there are many cases of widows continuing to run family businesses, and often trying to keep them going until their children, i.e. their sons, could take over. So I don't want you to think that women are totally economically marginal to Victorian life. Nonetheless, there is this increasing separation of the world of work and of home. Okay, and you can see that architecturally, very interesting, in the separation of workshops from homes. Okay, so banks, mills, not mills, like granary mills, butchers, any type of trade, people would often live above the shop or behind the shop. Okay, increasingly, the more prosperous that tradesmen came, the more they wanted to have a home set apart from their shop, so that their family life could continue in a way apart from their working life. And of course, it's from the 1860s that you get the growth of suburban enclaves in the cities, which is again a way of separating out, moving away from places of work. Now, the last point I want to make here is about the growing importance attached to household management. Okay? As women were made the guardians of the home, so household management was almost professionalized. It was endowed with greater status and prestige, so that women could take pride in how good a job they did in managing their home. And for some people, managing the home was a not inconsiderable task. If you were a wealthy aristocrat or merchant or a banker, you could have a positive army of servants working for you that had to be organized, even though you would have a butler and a chief maid. Nonetheless, your job was ostensibly to be the person who would manage the servants. Even, and if you read Mrs. Beeton, she has that lovely gradation of how many pounds a year you can, how many servants you can afford on how many pounds a year. But if you like, the middle classes, if you like, doctors, lawyers, people like that, had to have basically around £500 a year to be able to have 3 servants, and that was really the idea: a cook, a maid, and a manservant. That was the sort of the holy grail for the middle classes. Whereas the lower middle classes, people like teachers, shopkeepers, journalists, even who earned somewhere between sort of £200 to £300 a year, that meant that you could basically you would be at the lower end there, struggling to get 1 or 2 servants. Now, bear in mind, even for women who couldn't afford to have servants or could just afford to have 1 servant, that they had many, many more children than is usual today. So the sizes of most families meant that there were 5 or 6 children in the family. By the end of the century, that falls to sort of 3 or 4. But there's also often a whole lot of kith and kin who would also be living in the house. One of the most interesting things about the censuses is how many members of the extended family, and friends and extended family, tended to live in households. So there's a lot of work to be done in the household, okay? But that doesn't necessarily explain why it is that this new science of household management, which is what's it called in the what does it become called in the US? Home economics. This is the beginning of home economics. Emerges, and I'm suggesting that it emerges as a way of trying to reward or to valorize the work that women do in the domestic arena. And in the British case, the classic canonical work is Mrs. Beeton's book of household management, published in 1861, becomes a bestseller. It sells 60,000 copies in its first year, 2 million by the end of the decade, is still in print, still going enormously strong and popular. And if you read Mrs. Beeton, you get the idea of who it is that should be the perfect wife and mother. So some qualities that she alludes to in her description, and we won't go through the elaborate daily routine of what you have to do throughout your day in order to run the thing, but I would like people to give me some idea of some of the characteristics that the ideal mistress would have. Anyone got a yes?
So there's like a lot of emphasis on the suppression of your own feelings and keeping topics pleasant and don't talk to them too often. A lot of like your emotional state was supposed to be such that it would just make me pleasant for everyone involved.
Right, you were in a way a facilitator. You were almost, it wasn't that you were meant to be invisible, but that you were meant to be able to make everybody else happy around you. Any other suggestions? Any other? Yeah. What's your name? Sorry. Mimi.
Or like needlework or like
Keeping yourself busy and occupied.
or mind sharp.
Right. Needlework, playing the piano, painting, all the ways to cultivate a sort of genteel personality. Yes. Rebecca, isn't it?
There's a big emphasis on maintaining friendships.
Right. And why is friendship important? It's because they don't have Facebook, clearly. You know, it's very important to be able to make real friends and see if you can reach, you know, the 500 mark or the 1,000 mark. Does anyone in the room have over 1,000 friends on Facebook? Oh. Such an interesting phenomena that is. So friendship, the cultivation of friendship, because it's through friendship that you learn how to behave and perform publicly. It's how you keep your mind sharp. It's how you cultivate good habits. Any others? Yeah. Right. Absolute elaborate set of conventions about social etiquette so that you don't offend someone or you don't bring the reputation of your household down by acting in an inappropriate type of way. You get the idea, okay? And if you haven't read it, I urge you to do it because it's fantastic. And it's the sort of thing that will be bound to come up in the midterm. Okay, a couple of things I want to say then. What you have in the 19th century, particularly in the second half of the 19th century, is a codification of basically the routines of family life that now seem so familiar to us. So Victorian households, particularly ones of high status, were